learn together. Please join me in expressing our gratitude and warm welcome to author J.D. Vance.
Wow. Thank you, Eliana. I have to say that if I ever come back to Pacifica, don't force me to follow Eliana. Get somebody else to introduce me. That was really wonderful. Thank you for doing that, and thanks to David and to Mr. Carlson here for having me and for making me part of this wonderful community just for a little bit. I will say only one thing about my own direct personal involvement in politics, and that's that, of the many good things that come from running for political office, the one thing that I could do without is I don't get to see my family as much. And so the reason I have to leave is not because I don't want to hang out and talk to everybody, because I really do. That's actually the best part of doing these things. It's because I have to catch a red eye back home to Ohio so that I can take my son to breakfast tomorrow, which I promised him I would do. And so when I leave. When I leave, please don't feel insulted. I apologize. I really wish that I could stay longer, but unfortunately, there's like one direct flight to Cincinnati a day, and I had to catch it, and it's at 9:51, so I have to go. So I'll try to talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then Mr. Carlson and I will have a conversation and take some questions from the audience. I normally I never talk with notes, but I haven't given a real book talk in a couple of years, meaning just primarily focus on the book, where I'm not supposed to talk about politics so much. And so while I don't have notes, I do have this iPad from my friend Chris Applegate, because I want to read a couple of excerpts from my book. But this also apparently is getting text messages from some of Chris's friends, and so if you'll give me just a few minutes, I actually want to text everyone how great J.D. Vance is on Chris's contact list. So just give me a second here, because I want to do that. So just a bit of background on me. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. It was a town that for my grandparents was really the land of opportunity. It was a place where two hillbillies from southeastern Kentucky coal country could move and build a life for themselves, so long as they worked hard and played by the rules. And that was really the community that welcomed my grandparents. My grandfather was a union steel worker. He earned a wage that could support a family of 5 by himself, and he didn't have a college education. He did not have a fancy degree. What he had was a work ethic and a community where people really valued hard work and where they really rewarded it. And very briefly, the story of my life is really the story of how my grandparents built an incredible life for themselves in Middletown, and then as the entire industrial economy seemed to fade in southwestern Ohio, how their family, which of course became my family when I was born, struggled in really profound and extraordinary ways. And so my mother, who is a dear person, actually an incredibly compassionate and smart woman, struggled with opioid addiction for so much of my early childhood, such that my grandparents were the people who actually raised me, because they were the only people who really had the stability and the self-control to raise a couple of kids. And that's what they did, both for their own children, but also for my sister and myself. And I'm proud to say, and very happy to say, that we're blessed to have 6 years clean and sober with my mom now. And thank you. But I'll say, when I started to write this book, which was in 2012, a law school professor of mine by the name of Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom, if you've ever heard the name, Amy Chua encouraged me to turn what was then an academic writing paper into this book project, which eventually led to Hillbilly Elegy. And my mom, when I wrote the book, I thought would not make it to its publication. I really thought to myself that when this book came out, she would no longer be with us. And what an amazing blessing. And it's one of the great mysteries of grace that we sometimes find ourselves in situations that we never would have anticipated. And I'm so blessed to be here. And I really do believe that my mom has an incredible story to tell in her own right. And I think has been telling that story actually to a number of folks who are suffering with addiction in our home of Ohio. So things are amazing if you trust in God and let them unfold. Sometimes things really unexpected do happen, and I don't think I'd be here, certainly, and I don't think my mom would be here without them. So if there's a thesis behind Hillbilly Elegy, why did I write the book? What was I trying to accomplish? Well, the real reason that I wrote it is that I wanted to give people some insight, some understanding, some very direct feeling about what it felt like to come from a community like mine. So if you grew up poor in southwestern Ohio, whatever your racial or demographic group, I didn't feel like there were a whole lot of stories told about people like us, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to give people a sense of what it felt like to come from the community that I came from. And so I wrote the book for that purpose. That's why I wrote it. But if there's a thesis behind it, it's that one of the main determinants of whether we have a good life, one of the main drivers of whether we ultimately achieve our own goals and our own success and our own happiness is this concept of culture. And I felt that this concept was incredibly poorly defined. And so if you ask people from the left side of our political spectrum, why don't poor children do better in our country? Why do so many kids who are born at the bottom of our socioeconomic ladder stay trapped there? The classic left-wing answer is that they face structural economic problems. There aren't enough economic opportunities. There aren't enough good jobs. There aren't enough good schools. There are very fundamental reasons, barriers that stand in their way that make it impossible for them to achieve their dreams. And if you ask people on the right side of the political spectrum, the classic right-of-center perspective is that people just need to make better decisions. They need to exercise more personal responsibility. They need to accept that whatever disadvantages came to them in their life, they still have to overcome them and achieve something anyway. And that was sort of the political and social and intellectual environment in which I wrote this book, because what it seemed to me is that while both the left-wing story and the right-wing story had elements of truth, it was undoubtedly the case that people in my community needed to make better decisions. And it was also the case that people in my community would benefit from better job opportunities and better job prospects. There was this whole layer in the middle. There were churches and communities and social organizations. There were the schools that people went to. There was the entire culture that actually formed people that was missing from so many of these conversations. And so I thought that if I wrote about these arguments, wrote about these people in a very personal way, wrote about myself in a very honest and difficult way, I could give people some insight into what the community was like and the problems that they really faced. So what do I mean by culture? I want to just talk a little bit about this by illustrating the one excerpt that I want to read from my book. So one of the cool things about writing this book is I got to ask my family all these cool stories, for all these cool stories about my own background. I mean, some of these things happened that I'm writing about well before I was even born, and my family was really an open book. And the story that I'm about to tell you, I'll give you a little background for something that's not in the book, that at Thanksgiving, I believe in 2017, my Uncle Jimmy, who's my Mama and Papa's oldest kid, he was giving me a little bit of grief. He was saying, JD, I kind of wish you hadn't aired so much of the family's dirty laundry. I wish there was a little bit more privacy for some of these really intense personal details. And I said, Uncle Jimmy, some of the most intense personal stories actually came from you. You're the one who gave me all this stuff. He's the one who gave me the story that I'm about to read to you. And he said, yeah, I gave you all that stuff, but I didn't think anybody would read it, right? That's one lesson. If you're going to write a book about your family history, sometimes you think nobody's going to read it, but they actually do. So you better be prepared for it. But this story finds my grandparents very early after their migration from southeastern Kentucky coal country to southwestern Ohio. And they grew up in extraordinary poverty. I mean, poverty that I myself have never even experienced. I'm not talking about the poverty of maybe worrying that you might miss a meal or not being totally sure about how to afford necessities. I mean, my grandma would wake up, would eat fire coals when she was a child because of how deeply impoverished they were. This was incredibly gnarly stuff. So they get to Middletown, Ohio, and my grandfather earns, again, not a wealthy wage. He's lower middle class people, but a level of material comfort that they had never experienced in their entire life. And yet, even though they have this level of material comfort, they find it a little bit difficult to adjust to the new world that they find themselves in. They grew up in Appalachian, Kentucky. They grew up in a place where your grandparents and your parents and your aunts and uncles were constantly shuffling in about. They all of a sudden found themselves isolated in a certain way. There weren't any more grandparents and aunts and uncles, at least not most of the time. They were a little bit more isolated. They had a lot of money, at least by the standards of how they grew up, but they felt a little bit more lonely and a little bit isolated. And they were also adjusting to becoming a new married couple and new parents in this environment that was very unfamiliar to them. And so this is where the story actually picks up. So after a few years, Mamaw and Papaw began to adapt. Mamaw became close friends with the neighbor lady, that was her word for the neighbors she liked, who lived in a nearby apartment. Papaw worked on cars in his spare time, and his co-workers slowly turned from colleagues to friends. In 1951, they welcomed a baby boy, my Uncle Jimmy, and showered him with their new material comforts. Jimmy, Mamaw would later tell me, could sit up at 2 weeks, walk at 4 months, speak in complete sentences just after his first birthday, and read classic novels by age 3. A slight exaggeration, my uncle would later tell me. They visited Mamaw's brothers in Indianapolis and picnicked with their new friends. It was, Uncle Jimmy, a typical middle-class life, kind of boring, but happy in a way you appreciate only when you understand the consequences of not being boring. That's not to say things always proceeded smoothly. Once they traveled to the mall to buy Christmas presents with the holiday throng and let Jimmy roam so he could locate a toy he coveted. They were advertising it on television, he told me recently. It was a plastic console that looked like the dash of a jet fighter plane. You could shine a light or shoot darts. The whole idea was to pretend that you were a fighter pilot. Jimmy wandered into a pharmacy that happened to sell the toy, so he picked it up and began to play with it. The store clerk wasn't happy. He told me to put down the toy and get out. Chastised, young Jimmy stood outside in the cold until Mamaw and Papaw strolled by and asked if he'd like to go inside the pharmacy. "I can't," Jimmy told his father. "Why?" "I just can't." "Tell me why right now." And he pointed at the store clerk inside and said, "That man got mad at me and told me to leave. I'm not allowed to go back inside." Now, Mamaw and Papaw stormed in, and I emphasize stormed here, demanding an explanation for the clerk's rudeness. The clerk explained that Jimmy had been playing with an expensive toy. "This toy?" Papaw asked, picking up the toy. When the clerk nodded, Papaw smashed it on the ground, and utter chaos ensued. As Uncle Jimmy explained, quote, "They went nuts. Dad threw another of the toys across the store and moved toward the clerk in a very menacing way. Mom started grabbing random stuff off the shelves and throwing it all over the place. She's screaming," and this is PG, "kick his effing butt, kick his effing butt." And then Dad leans into this clerk and says very clearly, "If you say another word to my son, I will break your neck." The poor guy was completely terrified, and I just wanted to get out of there. The man apologized, and the Vances continued with their Christmas shopping as if nothing had happened. Now, what's the point of that story? Why do I tell that story? And I guess the point is that my grandparents grew up in a different culture, not a radically different culture, at least by the standards of the world, but a much different culture from the one that they had experienced as middle-class Ohioans. They grew up in a culture where virtually the only thing that really mattered, the only thing you could really control if you were an extremely poor person in southeastern Kentucky, was that sense of honor, that sense of loyalty, that sense of pride in your family. And as I learned as a kid, as my grandparents learned as a kid, when people insult your family, you don't accept it. You fight back, sometimes very aggressively if you have to. Now, that was obviously a pretty crazy story. That was not super common even in the lives of my grandparents, but I think the point is important, that even when we take people from one environment to another, even if we give them a lot of money relative to how they grew up, the way that they grew up still continues to influence them. They're still influenced by the expectations they were set by an earlier life. And that is the way in which I think culture is so important in our country, and so important certainly in the community that I came from. That if we want to give kids a better life, we can't just give them more money. We can't just give them better job opportunities. We can't just give them better educational opportunities. We also have to appreciate that how they grew up, the things that they saw, the expectations they form for themselves are really critical to influencing how they see their future opportunities. And if you're not dealing with that reality, if you're not dealing with the fact that a kid who grew up in poverty, even if he may not be poor anymore, grew up in a world where the poverty influenced how he saw his possibilities, then you're not actually going to be able to help people over the long term. And that, to me, is that middle layer of society, that cultural influence that I think so much of our public policy and our public conversation misses. That's why ultimately I wanted to write this book. I want to say just a few more things, and then I'll shut up. One, the book did very well. I mean, it was crazy. The initial print run on the book was 10,000 copies, and I remember the publisher arguing with me about whether it would even sell that many. I say this not to brag, but just to give some perspective. I think the most recent numbers that I saw is that the book has sold over 3 million copies. It's really crazy, right? Thank you. And part of the reason that it sold so well is that it was sort of picked up in 2016 as this attempt to explain the Trump phenomenon and the Trump voter. Where did this guy from out of nowhere come to capture the Republican nomination for president and then the presidency itself? Why were so many of these blue-collar Democrats so motivated and so inspired by this guy, who was a billionaire from Queens? And I think that in some ways I've always been really uncomfortable with that application of the book. I mean, the book is not a very political thing. It's weird to say that now as a guy who's running for political office. But the book is not really political. It doesn't mention Trump's name. It doesn't mention Hillary Clinton's name. It's not really about the 2016 election. But the one way in which I think that it is a fair attempt, or at least a reasonable thing to do, to pick up hillbilly elegy to try to understand a segment of the country, is that it really is about a working class community that shifted very, very hard from the Democrats to the Republicans over about a 20-year period. And my grandfather voted for one Republican in his entire life. He voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, and that was more because he hated Walter Mondale, Reagan's opponent, than because he liked Ronald Reagan. But I am certain that if my grandfather was alive in 2016, he would have been absolutely obsessed with Donald Trump. And I think that would have been true of my grandma, who never voted, like many people who live in poverty, had never voted for an election in her entire life, but I think she may have actually voted for Trump in 2016. But why is that? And I think the answer is a really important part to understanding where we are as a country and where we are as a culture and a community. I think the answer is that a lot of people understood that Trump represented an effort to at least push back against some of the many, many problems that existed in communities like mine. Even if you personally do not think Trump's ideas were good or his solutions were good, and we can have that argument during Q&A if you'd like to, what we did represent is a recognition that the same way that we'd been doing things in this country simply wasn't working for people like my family. And that, to me, was what really the Trump phenomenon was about. And if I'm being honest, I think there was also something interesting and similar, if different, going on the left. Because in the same election, a guy who was not even a registered Democrat from Vermont, a socialist by the name of Bernie Sanders, nearly captured the Democratic nomination for president. And so we almost had a scenario where you had Trump running against Bernie Sanders. It's hard to imagine a stronger rejection of the political consensus that existed in our country than that our political elites tried to run Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, and they were a few thousand votes away from getting Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. Think about that. Now, I have a dear friend. His name is Michael Lind. He's sort of a Reagan Democrat. He's a political scientist at the University of Texas, Austin. I think he's the smartest political mind that I've ever spoken to. And in 2015, Michael Lind told me something I will never forget this. He said, American politics, you have to think of as represented by four people: Donald Trump, Paul Ryan, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders. These are the four most important people in American politics. And what Mike said to me at the time was, in 20 years, Trump and Sanders will be part of the same political party, and Paul Ryan and Hillary Clinton will be part of the same political party. At the time, I was like, that sounds pretty crazy. But if you think about the trajectory of the parties, if you think about who's voting for each political candidate, and you even just think about the messages of the different political parties, I think it's actually really smart. And there is a lot of evidence that the same people who voted for Bernie Sanders and the Democratic coalition really like Donald Trump and vice versa. Why is that? Why is there such an anti-establishment movement in this country? I think it's because a lot of people feel like my grandparents felt, like my family felt, that things just haven't been going that well. And the problems that we see have not been solved by conventional politicians for the last 30 or 40 years. And whether you like Sanders or whether you like Trump or whether you hate one or the other or both of them, I guess my request here would be pretty simple, which is that to recognize that we live in a remarkable period of instability in American politics. And I think we live in a remarkable period of instability in American politics because so many of the problems that exist in the middle of the country are not being solved. They've been there for a while. If anything, they seem to be getting worse. The opioid epidemic probably will kill more people in 2021 than it has killed in any period in our history, and yet we very rarely talk about it. the manufacturing decline that exists in the middle of our country, where the Chinese and other countries have stolen a very large segment of our industrial and manufacturing base, that trend continues really unabated. And eventually, people get really angry, and they start looking for very unconventional problems, or very unconventional politicians to solve the very obvious problems. And I think that is the environment that we're in. Very unstable in some ways, but I think very exciting, because we're starting to finally talk about the real problems that exist in this country. That is the spirit in which I wrote Hillbilly Elegy, not to provide an answer to any of these questions, but to just ask questions that I felt like hadn't really been asked by enough people in our national politics. And it's in that spirit that I hope you read it. Whether you agree with all of my conclusions or not, whether you don't like my politics as they existed then or they existed now, I hope that at least you recognize that there are really significant problems in our country that are going largely unsolved, and unless we start solving them, we're going to have even bigger problems down the road. Thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
So I forgot to mention the paper and the pen on your chairs is to write down questions. So as they're making their way up here, go ahead and write your questions. The ladies over here to my right, they're going to stand up. If you have a question written, just put it up in the air, and they're going to come grab them for you.
Let's jump in on that cultural piece that you told us about. One thing with our politics in flux, I wonder a little bit if it's not in large part because our culture is in flux and the two are united. But we're here as part of an offering from a relatively young startup high school, and trying to impact culture in the next generation kind of in a faith-based educational format. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of your thoughts on your own kind of journey from an education standpoint. Your mother was top of her class and yet still has the struggles you talked about, and then you kind of had a breakthrough in your family. What role does educating the next generation, what's that going to play in this political moment that we're in, and more importantly, maybe the cultural moment that we're in?
So first, as I told Keith earlier, please ask questions about whatever's on your mind. I've asked him to select the weirdest questions to present to me. So
as defined by me.
Yeah, as defined by Keith here. So maybe they won't be that weird, or maybe they'll be really weird. We don't know each other that well, but I think that. Look, education for me personally was an incredibly powerful motivator and engine of upward mobility, right? So nobody in my family, in my immediate family at least, that ever graduated from a four-year college. I graduated from Ohio State and then went on to Yale Law School. I mean, the trajectory of my life just seemed totally crazy to anyone in my family, and certainly to me personally. Now, that said, I do worry about that, actually. I actually worry much more about the role of education in our society now than I did even when I wrote the book, because, the thing that was possible for my grandpa was to support a family on a good middle-class wage, even though he hadn't gotten a four-year degree. And so often I think the story that we tell people is that if you want respect, if you want material comfort, if you want any measure of prestige, you almost have to have a four-year college degree to get it. And we, even some of our jobs, even those that frankly probably don't require or need four-year college degrees, we basically tell people they've got to go and get them in order to have these professions, in order to have access to these careers. And I don't think that's a good thing, actually. I think it's especially true in an environment which is what we face in this country right now, where the universities, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to be honest, they've really taken a side in the culture war in a very institutional way. I mean, most universities, almost every university, in fact, is explicitly on the side of the left in the culture wars. Well, if that's true, does it really make a ton of sense that we've actually created an environment and an economy where you've got to go through these universities to have much chance of success in the 21st century economy? I think the answer is probably not. And I think one of the ways in which our society has probably failed pretty profoundly is by making the university effectively a requirement of being able to access the middle class life at the same time that we've gutted vocational education, we've gutted the trades, we've made it harder for people who want to work with their hands to earn a good living, even though there are a lot of good jobs out there for people who want to work with their your hands. So I think we've probably made a pretty big cultural and educational mistake here. I think obviously I have personally benefited from our educational system, so it's hard for me to cast stones at it, but I'm in politics now, so I can say anything.
A trademark of the profession. From your book, whatever talents I have, I almost squandered until a handful of loving people rescued me. That is the real story of my life, and that is why I wrote this book. I want people to know what it feels like to nearly give up on yourselves and why you might do it. I want people to understand what happens in the lives of the poor and the psychological impact that spiritual and material poverty has on their children. Why do you want people to know what that feels like? Where do you hope this goes? Where do you hope this takes the reader and our society?
Well, I guess pretty simply, if we want to solve problems, and I think most of us here, whatever our politics or cultural background, actually want the poor to be able to have a better life in our country, we've got to be honest about what's actually going on. You have to describe the problem honestly and openly if you want to start a conversation about how to solve anything. Diagnosis is the most important part of treating an illness. If you don't know what you're dealing with, then you don't actually know how to fix it. And so that's really what it was all about, is I wanted people just to understand what this felt like so that we could maybe get a little bit smarter about how to solve some of these problems over the long term. And honestly, if I'm being just totally direct, do I think that the takeaway of Hillbilly Elegy was, at a large scale, let's try to help all of the people that J.D. Vance is writing about in the book? I think, unfortunately, the answer is no. I think a lot of people took it as a political book. A lot of people tried to sort of draw whatever political lessons they could and then have discarded it. But I do think we've largely moved on from caring about a lot of the people that I wrote about in the book. I mean, in 2016, there was this very brief period where I felt like everyone was asking really thoughtful questions and seemed really concerned about some of the problems that I was writing about. And then by like 2017 or 2018, we'd moved on to something else. That's probably more of an indictment of our society than anything else, but it does make me a little sad because we seem completely unable in this country to focus on actual long-term problems and how to help people who are really suffering, and that's a pretty sad thing.
You want the weird ones, right?
Please.
Okay, so
we'll all have more fun.
I know a lot of the folks in this room. I have a slight guess where this one's coming from. Probably not a future Pacifica graduate, but we'll see. As a Marine, could you take out Jason Bourne? If not, how long would you last? So now we're getting down to the deep stuff. Mr. O'Neill's probably going to go heartburn. I'm not going to name names. I will talk to him on the drive home later tonight, though. I don't know. It doesn't say. It's
look. I'd love to say that I could take Jason Bourne. I think the honest answer is that I'd last somewhere between 2 and 10 seconds with Jason Bourne.
Excellent. There's a series of questions here. A lot of your comment about the Clinton-Ryan party and the Bernie Sanders-Trump party in the future. One is your own personal view on where you'll stand and why, if that's the way things split. But then a follow-up to that is, what do you see is the uniting factor that would pull Trump fans together with someone who's in favor of socialism? And I would note, to back up your thesis, that in some exit polls early on in the 16 primary, when Sanders voters were asked if you couldn't have voted for Sanders, who would your next choice have been? And the number one answer was Trump, which speaks to your point. But anyways, 15 years from now, there we are. Where will you stand, and what do you think it is that's really pulling these all together?
Yeah, I mean, look, if that's actually where politics goes, and it's probably a bit of an oversimplification, but I'm definitely in the Trump-Sanders party over the long term, because I think at least that it's focused on real long-term challenges. And let me just give one example. So I think that in corporate America right now, we've become incredibly obsessed. And I've, sort of worked in the private sector for the last 4 years. I have my own investment firm. I sort of work in the world of the capitalist economy. People have become incredibly obsessed with, I think, fake problems instead of real problems. So a very real problem is that if you're a small business owner, or if you're a middle class or working class homeowner, whether you're black or white, it's actually much, much harder to get capital to start a business, to refinance your home, and so forth, than it probably should be. That's true in inner city Baltimore. It's true in exurban southwestern Ohio. It's true in Appalachia. It's true, again, whether you're white or black or Latino. And yet, corporate America right now is incredibly focused on these 3 words: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So on the one hand, you could actually loan money to a black-owned business, or on the other hand, you could appoint a black Harvard Business School graduate to your board. Which one is actually going to really make people's lives better, and yet which one is corporate America overwhelmingly focused on? And I really worry that the Clinton-Ryan party, if that's what we're going to call it, is very focused on fake problems instead of real problems, and that's a very real concern of mine. And even if you don't agree with the solutions of the Trump-Sanders party, I think it's at least focusing on the real problems.
Do Americans have a common culture that we even share anymore? With a follow-up question of what unites us, and then someone else's question, but along the same line, looking forward, what could bring us all back together to some sort of commonality, some sort of e pluribus unum, sort of we're all coming together, though we're all very different people. Where's the commonality? Where has it been lost, and how might we restore it?
Well, I think that in important ways, culturally, even if not in our actual stated preferences, I think we're still heavily influenced by Christian theology and Christian virtue in this country. And that's a very good thing. That's a solid foundation to start from. A famous Supreme Court opinion, I believe from 1891, said something to the effect of, this is a Christian country. And I think that even if you're not a Christian in America, it's remarkable how influential Christian thought is in the development of our legal tradition, our political tradition, and even the way that we talk about problems, about our obligations to the world, about our obligations to each other. I think that's good. I do think that most Americans, whoever they voted for, whatever their political preferences, I think most Americans are focused on the same basic set of problems. I think they're worried about how to put food on the table. They're worried about where they're going to send their kids to school. They're worried about giving their families the right opportunities, and I think that's a solid foundation. But I do think that we actually have an industry of division mongers that benefit from the division of the U.S. population. And they're very powerful, and they make a lot of money from it, and they benefit culturally and politically from dividing us constantly, right? I mean, there's this I'm sorry to pick on this person, but there's this preposterous book by this woman named Robin DiAngelo, and the basic argument of the book is that if you are a white person, it's not merely enough to reject racism. It's not merely enough to reject judging people based on the color of your skin, but you need to actively engage in all these ridiculous performances to sort of reject your racial privilege. And they go so far as to include, if you look at some of the examples in some of her writing, some of the examples are like going up to, like people who are strangers, black people who are strangers, and apologizing for your racial privilege. And I know a lot of black people, I don't know that any of them want white people to go up to them in a restaurant and apologize for their racial privilege. That's weird, right? So if you want to actually have friendships and real relationships, we actually need to get away from that, and we need to focus on the things that are more than skin deep. And that's unfortunately what many of our political and cultural leaders are actively encouraging us not to do. I think we need to have the courage to fight back against it so that we can see people as common humans and common Americans.
Okay. So I note the subtitle of the book is A Memoir of a Family and Culture in Crisis. family and culture. And then one of the questions was, could you expand on your definition of culture and then address even like a microculture, specifically a culture within the family? Both of them could go off the rails. One of them could go off the rails. You could have a healthy family and a messed up culture. You could have a messed up culture, but instead of what's going on with this, the kind of the decline of family culture and also the macro American culture. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the culture that I think I'm really talking about in the book is what I broadly define as Greater Appalachian culture or Appalachian culture. And I think it's one of the largest subcultures within the United States of America. It really stretches arguably from the Deep South all the way into New Hampshire. It's primarily, though not exclusively, white. It's primarily, though not exclusively, working class. It has a deep connection to the Appalachian Mountains, to little things like the way that the mountains look, to the species of plant and animal life that are there. They're sort of burned into our memory, the things that we thought about and talked about as children. And I also think that there are sort of shared cultural traits. Again, they're not universal, but they're very common. This sense of loyalty, of duty, of honor. There have been very interesting studies that people who have an Appalachian background value honor and duty and loyalty in a very extreme way, right? So there's this famous study, I think it was done at the University of Michigan, they don't quote me on that, that basically tried to look at an Appalachian person or a set of Appalachian people and a set of non-Appalachian people. And basically it was, you take the Appalachian person, put them in a relatively narrow hallway, and see how they responded to a person walking past them. And the Appalachian people would not move an inch, right? They were sort of not willing to have a stranger, because the idea is the stranger would act relatively aggressive. It's like, I'm going to get out of the way for somebody who won't even speak to me, who's acting relatively aggressive towards me. But the non-Appalachian people, even though the stranger was acting a little bit aggressive, were very willing to sort of get out of the way, right? So I think this sense of honor is really, really burned into the community that I came from. And yeah, I mean, look, the objective evidence is that a lot of the families in the community that I came from are struggling. They're very often experiencing problems like the one that I experienced. There's much more fatherlessness in the home, though again, that's not exclusive to Appalachian culture. There's much more family dissolution. There's much more family breakdown. And I really worry about this stuff, because I think that the family is the fundamental unit of society, and it worries me that so many of the families in my own community aren't doing very well. And again, I think it's complicated. It's social, cultural, economic, and all this other stuff, but it really is a problem. Now, what's interesting to go back to this broader question of culture is there's this really fascinating paper that was written by this guy, Raj Shetty, who I think was at Stanford at some point, but now he's somewhere else. But he's a very brilliant microeconomist. And he studied the effect of family dysfunction and family dissolution on a poor kid's prospects in life. And unsurprisingly, people who grow up in broken families from poor communities are less likely to have good lives than people who grow up in poor families but with functional families. But interestingly, and the most fascinating part of this finding is that the children who grew up in communities with a lot of single-parent homes almost did as badly as the children who grew up in individually broken homes themselves. In other words, you would almost rather grow up in a broken home, but where the community around you has a lot of intact families, than you would grow up in a really intact family, but where your entire community is surrounded by broken homes. So it's not just what's going on at the home, it's what's going on in the community around you. A lot of broken homes in your neighborhood are just as powerful as growing up without a father in your own home yourself. That's really powerful, right? But again, I think it's intuitive to pretty much anybody who thinks about the way that human beings actually work. And if you grow up in a place where fatherlessness abounds, where you don't see daddies in the homes, it doesn't really work out for you, even if maybe your family is relatively intact.
So the Buckeye, the Ohio State guys, just quoting the Michigan study here. We should probably turn the microphone off for that one, right?
Don't hold it against me.
Every year in November, my next door neighbor, proud Ohio State grad, for the big game, gets a 6-foot inflatable boot that's going about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I wake up to the boot is out there in the front lawn. It's good. He told me sad news, though, from Michigan just a couple of weeks ago before classes start. One of the Michigan libraries burned down, and it was a real problem because half of the books weren't even colored in yet. So I don't know if that's going to help in the state or not. Stuff like that. if you're thinking about that joke, you really are going to know what I mean. The breakdown, the fatherlessness, the impact that has, and then the community rallying around. I mean, it kind of harkens to your own story, where the grandparents stepped in to provide the stability, and they fought through it. They preserved their relationship through some hard times. In their generation, they weren't going to give up, but then in their own children's generation, it was kind of lost. You reflect back on that and see something that happened. I mean, it's not that long ago, 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. It's in our window of history for those of us in the room. What do you see from your own experience, having lived the exact point I think you're talking about? What's causing one generation to give up on fatherhood when the other one was so doggedly determined to stick it out even in tough times?
Yeah, this is really complicated. I could probably spend the whole evening talking about just this particular issue. One, I do think that while I don't think this is primarily an economic problem, I do want to talk about the economic piece of it, which is that we're really uncomfortable admitting to ourselves in our, society that's very focused on gender equity and equality, that men and women really are different. And the decline of manufacturing hit male employment much harder than it hit female employment. Even assuming that you have sort of equal labor force participation rates, when you have those manufacturing jobs disappear, it affects the fathers more than it affected the mothers. And one of the things we see consistently is that when men are unemployed, it's very hard for them to build families themselves. And so I do think that this makes maybe some people uncomfortable in the audience. The fact that we lost a lot of stable male employment was a catastrophe for the American family. More than the economic consequences, more than the fact that the jobs disappeared and the good wages disappeared, a lot of families suffered and struggled in ways that if you're just looking at men and women as interchangeable, you would not appreciate. But if you recognize that moms and dads really are different, that men and women need different things, you recognize that we've got a real problem here, and we continue to have a real problem here. But I mean, culturally, something has clearly shifted. I mean, I think it's easy, but also probably true, to blame the sexual revolution in the 1960s. My grandparents had an incredibly chaotic marriage in a lot of ways, but they never got divorced, right? They were together to the end, till death do us part. That was a really important thing to my grandmother and my grandfather. That was clearly not true by the 70s or 80s. And I think that probably, I was personally, and a lot of the kids in my community grew up in my generation, personally suffered from the fact that a lot of moms and dads saw marriage as a basic contract, right? Like any other business deal. Once it becomes no longer good for one of the parties or both of the parties, you just dissolve it and go on to a new business relationship. But that recognition that marriage was sacred, I think, was a really powerful thing that held a lot of families together. And when it disappeared, unfortunately, a lot of kids suffered. And this is one of the great tricks that I think the sexual revolution pulled on the American populace, which is this idea that, these marriages were fundamentally, they were maybe even violent, but certainly they were unhappy. And so getting rid of them and making it easier for people to shift spouses like they change their underwear, that's going to make people happier in the long term. And maybe it worked out for the moms and dads, though I'm skeptical, but it really didn't work out for the kids of those marriages. And I think that's what all of us should be honest about, is we've run this experiment in real time, and what we have is a lot of very, very real family dysfunction that's making our kids unhappy.
So I want to, we got a few minutes left before we allow you to reunite with your family and bring Dad back home. You're starting to jump in on the political arena, and much of the book is in the cultural and family space. What do you see are some policy avenues, or maybe there aren't any, and it's all cultural avenues, and if so, what are they, that are going to reinvigorate Americans' belief in the institution of marriage, their steadfastness in their marriages, even in difficult circumstances? Are there policy steps that can be taken from the State House or Washington, D.C., alongside the churches and community organizations? What do you think are some steps that we can be taking as a people to address the problem?
Yeah, so to be clear, I think the cultural stuff really matters, but it's so complicated, and I talk about it a lot in the book, so I'll focus more on the policy stuff. So there are two things in the policy arena that I think we could do that would really boost marriage stability and formation over the long term. The first is rebuilding the American manufacturing economy for middle-class workers. If you want to have healthy, stable families, you need normal middle-class people without a college education to be able to support themselves. You need that source of employment. You need that source of dignity, that source of pride, that source of community. That's really important. And so I think the long-term economic competition that we have with China and with other countries, if we can recapture some of that Native American industrial base, we're going to do much better in family formation. There's a very specific policy that I've actually become a very big fan of, and it's been tried in Hungary and a couple of other countries, where basically what they do, and it's both to send a material signal, but also just send a cultural signal from leadership that marriage is really important. What they basically do is that every new couple, when they get married, they get a low-interest loan that is from the government, and you have to pay it back. But you don't have to pay it back if you get married and stay married for a certain period of time. And it basically just sends the signal that we really value this institution, it's sacred, and we're going to send not just a cultural signal, but we're going to send a monetary signal to go along with it. And it's really crazy. The amount of marriage has skyrocketed, and the amount of stable long-term marriages has skyrocketed too. So I think there is real opportunity to send a message through public policy that this is a sacred institution and we should continue to build it.
So there was one here, forgetting that he's in Ohio, and maybe the most famous one, that I thought maybe was going to be on the, let's see how weird we can get him. But as I thought about this question, I think this one's actually quite good and quite serious, and it ties into another question with respect to, the other question was along the lines of your concepts of the middle and the left and the right. How does that actually impact the lives, economy, and cultures of many of the minority communities that are impoverished? Because, I mean, yours is a story of an impoverished white community, but there's a question of minorities. But that's background for this question. What do you and LeBron James have in common? The two most famous Ohioans that we know of.
Wow. You guys need to do some more Ohioans. If LeBron James is number one, that's understandable. But if I'm the second most famous Ohioan, then we've got some problems out here in Orange County. John Glenn is from Ohio. First man to orbit the Earth. Yeah. Okay. Well, really. Neil Armstrong, first man to walk. Anyway, I'm an Ohio partisan. Well, I mean, I guess the obvious thing is that both of us grew up without a father in the home, and both of us probably would have been totally screwed if it hadn't been for strong women in our lives. That's easy.
Yeah, I mean, you have a line just in the beginning that you hope that people would hear your story not through a racial lens and think about it from the standpoint of what this poverty does to people's, not just their material health and well-being, there's the Mountain Dew mouth, but their spiritual well-being, and how why not look at it like our society wants to right now, as it's all on a race-based analysis, instead of looking at it from a spiritual and a material poverty basis?
Well, first of all, I think that it's very useful to people in power to look at it through purely a racial lens, because if you keep, working middle-class white people and black people on separate teams, then it's ultimately very good for people in power. And if you actually have a coalition of working-class and middle-class white and black people on the same political team, then you might actually get something really done in this country. And that's I think, why so many people are actively invested in creating division and pushing division. I guess, the point that I'd make here is one of the most interesting things that I've ever read, and I will never forget it because I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is the best description of what I've seen in my own community, was a book by this guy named William Julius Wilson called The Truly Disadvantaged. And Bill Wilson is a black sociologist from Harvard. He's probably in his late 70s now. He's still alive, at least as far as I know. And I actually met him a couple years ago and was really, really amazed by. We had a really interesting conversation. We went to dinner together, and I remember reading his book in high school that was about black people in inner city Chicago and thinking, oh my God, this is the smartest thing that's ever been written about my community. Right? Like this describes what's happened. And basically the story that he tells is you have this massive decline of manufacturing employment. The men all lose their jobs. The women get sick of the men not working and not being able to provide. The families disappear. The people who can move out leave. And everybody who's left, that's the truly disadvantaged. The people who are caught in this incredibly concentrated cycle of poverty, of hopelessness, of joblessness. And that, to me, was such an accurate description of what I had seen growing up, where, the jobs disappear, the men aren't working as much, the families dissolve, the drugs move in, and it's amazing to me that even as a kid I could recognize what was obvious, I think, to most people who have common sense, which is the problems that are common among some of these communities are common among black people and white people. Right, the pain of fatherlessness, very common in the neighborhood that I grew up in, also really common in a lot of lower class black neighborhoods in Ohio too. And I think just talking about those problems, talking about those issues, and trying not to put the constant racial prism on it, which our society is so obsessed with race, and not as obsessed with fatherlessness or joblessness, or I think all the things that matter much more than the color of your skin. But I think talking about it as if it doesn't have primarily a racial prism is really, really helpful, and it's unfortunate more people don't do it.
I want to do one more passage towards the end of your book. You met with your young friend Brian, who sounds like he's got a bit of a start to his life pretty similar to yours, so there's a lot of connection there. And you wrote that any chance he has lies with the people around him, his family, me, my kin, the people like us, and the broad community of hillbillies. And if that chance is to materialize, we hillbillies must wake the hell up. Brian's mom's death was another shitty card in an already abysmal hand, but there are many cards left to deal. Whether the community empowers him with a sense that he can control his own destiny, or encourages him to take refuge in resentment at forces beyond his control. Whether he can access a church that teaches him lessons of Christian love, family, and purpose. Whether those people who do step up to positively influence Brian find emotional and spiritual support from their neighbors. So you're embarking now with that as backdrop of what you think is going to matter in Brian's life. You're embarking on a run for the United States Senate. How do you feel that what you could do in the Senate, or what any politician maybe right now can do, hits at those fundamental things that have to happen to help a kid like Brian, or maybe a kid like you back some years ago? Where do family and churches and politics intersect? And what's your vision for getting into the political arena, knowing what you know about Brian and what it's going to take for him?
Sure. So when I wrote that passage, the book came out in 2016. I probably actually wrote that passage in 2014, if I had to guess, just based on, thinking about where I was when I wrote it. So that's 7 years later, and I actually, even though the kid's name is not Brian, I changed his name to protect his identity. But I know how Brian's doing, and I'd say it's not catastrophic, but it's not great. Right? He's gone from a teenager to a young man, and things just aren't going really well for him. And I guess that one of the real struggles of writing this book and of delivering this message is we've got to be able to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. And that's one thing our culture is very bad at. We have to recognize that what people like Brian need at an individual and community level is empowerment, a recognition that they still have some control over their life, a recognition that even though they have real disadvantage, that they were dealt a pretty crappy hand of cards, that they've still got some personal responsibility, some capacity to play that hand in the right way. That's thought one. And then thought two is that people who are in a leadership position in this country have to be willing to try to help that kid in whatever way that they can, whether that's through public policy or good nonprofit action, church community involvement, whatever the case may be. We've got to have space in our country to recognize the importance of personal responsibility, but recognize all of our responsibility, I think, to help our fellow countrymen and women in need. That's something that I do worry about, if I'm being honest with you, because I think we want to do one or the other, right? We want to just focus on the fact that people are victims, or we want to just focus on the fact that people are agents with personal responsibility. And sometimes what we really need in this country is a recognition that all of us have a responsibility to care for one another, but also people from tough circumstances still have some control over their own lives. Both of those messages are important.
Wonderful. So we're going to exercise a little personal responsibility and let Mr. Vance get out and get on that red eye so we can go see his family right now. Could you all stay seated for one moment while we wrap up? Let's give him a great thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much for being here.
Great to have you. I hope to have you back. Yeah. Real quick. Thank you all.